The Last Green Light, Chapter 1. When I was on leave from the Navy during the last days of the Great War, I took a train across Italy to the south of France. I had learned enough French from previous journeys to understand most of the signs and advertisements there. La quinquina royale est un vrai trésor meant this quinine-laced aperitif was, in the opinion of advertisers at least, a real treasure. Semer des pommes de terre pour les soldats, pour la France, urged you to plant potatoes for the soldiers and for France. One of the signs I liked best for its brevity and common sense was posted near the tracks at level crossings and read, Un train peut en cacher un autre. One train can hide another. It warned you to not pay heed solely to the express thundering toward you on the near track, not to cross as soon as it passed when another train, hidden by the first, might be roaring, smoking, speeding at you on the far track to crush you into oblivion. I mention this in connection with the murder of the late Jim Gatz, better known as J. Gatsby, and the love affairs notoriously connected with his death, all of which made headlines in the papers for a week or so last fall, until other news of this turbulent time chased that tragedy into the papers, into the gossip pages, and finally to the shallows and back eddies of our recall, so that for 6 months or more, a mention of the name Gatsby might conjure, around New York at least, a foggy memory on the order of, wasn't that the millionaire who was shot to death on Long Island? Something to do with a woman or with shady deals? Until at last J. Gatsby passed from the public's memory altogether. But not from mine. My name is Jan Lane, also known as John. I was probably the one person outside his family in the Midwest who, by the time he died, had known Gatsby the longest. I remember clearly when I first met him, and in a way because this was the day, I learned later, he first adopted his new name, I met him at the moment of his birth, on a cloud-strewn morning in 1905, with a sharp wind blowing out of the northwest, on the yacht Tuolumne off Little Girl's Point in Lake Superior. We were anchored there to allow the yacht's owner, Dan Cody, to rendezvous with one of his fancy women who lived nearby in Saxon Harbor. I was on anchor watch in the wheelhouse when I spotted Gatsby, rowing hard in a fishing skiff from shore. As he came under the ship's gangway, he shouted up at me that the weather was changing and the shallow ground off Little Girl's Point was dangerous and ablow, and we should move. The shouting drew Cody to the rail, and he asked the man to come aboard and explain himself. Gatsby was very young then, maybe 17 or 18. He was well built and tan from working on the water. I remember a chestnut pompadour, a strong chin, and a grin he spread like melted butter over everyone around. He carried himself with an offhand grace that seemed to belong to someone different, a man of high standing who had ended up fishing the Southwest Lake by accident or maybe on a lark. And he was a great talker. I am of Finnish stock and not gifted in that department, so I watched in some admiration as Gatsby forged a tale of storm and shipwreck and his own expertise that seemed to imply in form rather than content that even the worst obstacles must waste to clinker in a furnace of optimism, the location of which he alone knew the secret. He used his hands while talking, and ostentatiously, like an Italian, but subtly, changing their angle to the wrists and back, as if marking time with his words. By the time he'd finished, even Cody, who had made his fortune as a prospector in the Nevada silver fields and was tough-minded about everything except women, had fallen for his charm and enthusiasm and asked me to sign him on as deckhand. It so happened we'd been a man short since Cleveland. I don't mean to imply that Gatsby was a fraud or a charlatan, as many have suggested, although it's true that when Jay died, he and I were engaged in a game that was far from above board. He knew his way around a foredeck and worked hard on Tuolumne, so that after 16 months he was promoted to second mate under myself and Captain Erickson. Gatsby and I were friends at first, not close, but friends in the way you become when both are young, agreeable, and rely on each other day in, day out to keep a ship running and safe. We steamed through the St. Lawrence that year, then down to the West Indies and crossed the Atlantic to French North Africa. The next year we crossed back to Florida and to Panama. But Gatsby had a plan which did not include working on yachts forever, and he started implementing the plan from his very first day on Tuolumne. He did so by conversing with Dan Cody every chance he got and doing odd jobs for him, such as locating women in different ports. That had nothing to do with the ship, and so became, after a couple of years, the old man's confidant and private secretary. By the time Cody's former lover, Ella Kay, came back on the scene and Tuolumne was laid up, Gatsby had acquired, as if by osmosis, the old man's jargon of bank finance and the commodities trade, riding a train of speech that, while it still rolled on the great plain vowels of his Midwestern home, pulled a cargo of somewhere else, as if, instead of his few weeks at St. Olaf College, he'd been educated in a school stuffed with lacquered oak and silver tea services, equidistant from Newport, Chicago, and the Isle of Wight. It was not a change that did our friendship any good. And here perhaps I should point to why by saying something about myself. I was born in Duluth to immigrants from Finland, which was then a colony of Russia. My father had been a ferryman, and his brother, my Uncle Tai, worked in a ship chandlery in the Ulauluma area of Helsinki. After running into trouble for anti-government activities, which in those days could mean something as tame as saying the Tsar was a bit out of touch with his subjects, they emigrated to Minnesota. Like half of Scandinavia, it seemed they had cousins there. And when they got to Duluth, my uncle naturally sought work in one of the supply businesses that were springing up, like chanterelles in rain, to service the twin ports. After Ty found a job, he hired my father to run a boat that ferried goods to vessels anchored off Minnesota Point. Around the time I came along, they had started their own chandlery, Lane Brothers, in a brick warehouse on West Superior Street. And it grew fast with the ports, with the increasing number of ships come to haul Dakota wheat and Mesabi iron ore, ships that needed great quantities of paint, oil, rope, turnbuckles, charts, canvas, and all the other myriad goods Lane Brothers kept in stock. The chandlery grew so fast that the brothers started to disagree over how to manage a company that now employed over 50 workers. Ty wished to expand into coal and lumber, whereas my father, more cautious, thought they should stick to the business they knew, till eventually, with little acrimony and less talk, my uncle bought his brother out. I was 18 at that point and going to the same college Gatsby would attend 5 years later. But whereas Gatsby only spent a couple of weeks at St. Olaf, I studied there for over a year, happily absorbing philosophy, history, and other disciplines that would never get me a job in the real world. Until one day, in November of sophomore year, my father, who had invested all his profits from the chandlery, on Ty's advice, in a new railway company, the Mesabi, Duluth, and Chicago, arrived, unannounced, to tell me that the railway had gone bust and taken the family's savings and my tuition money with it. Though I was hardly aware of it at the time, this was the tail end of the 1901 financial panic, one of the many crises of capitalism that skewed the course of my life, among others, in the infant years of the new century. My uncle found me work on one of the supply boats, but it was clear that the good jobs at Lane Brothers must go to his sons. Counseled by a childhood friend who worked on a tugboat that Lane Brothers supplied, I soon took a more lucrative job on his tug, a job whose side effects, curiously, would later rekindle, then cool, my friendship with Gatsby. For the Duluth tugs in 1903 were a hotbed of revolution. The Steel and Railway Trust had succeeded in banning unions like the Knights of Labor and the AFL from most mining, shipping, and railroad operations. But half the tugboat men of Duluth, many of whom were Finns like Seppo and me, rejected an open shop. A tugboatman's strike the year before had triggered a running feud between scab boats and union tugs that resulted in near collisions, rammings, even the occasional gunfight as we raced to be first to dock a ship. The McRae Company tugs were union. Seppo and the crew of the Alice McRae were members of both the Duluth Superior Watermen's Guild and of the Finnish Socialist Federation. And when the Federation joined the International Workers of the World, we joined the IWW as well, and marched with heads high through Duluth in solidarity with workers everywhere. By then, my parents had sold their house and moved to a cottage in Superior. By then, I too had moved to lodgings on St. Croix Avenue, a stretch of Scandinavian saloons, boarding houses, saunas, and brothels between the high ground and the Duluth ship canal. The contrast between mansions rising in my old neighborhood to house officers for Carnegie's Steelworks, Morgan's Banks, and Rockefeller's Railways, and the scrawny kids and struggling charwomen living in cold, rat-sick rooms in Finntown, together with the political fervor of Seppo and the rest of our crew, soon brought me, singing with the passion of the newly converted, into the choir of a revolutionary movement we were certain must soon succeed. But the revolution never came. A year later, Seppo and another McRae engineer were ambushed by a scab crew outside a saloon on Rice's Point. Seppo was stabbed in the stomach and died in great pain in the dirt of Garfield Avenue. Jack McRae sold his fleet to a company controlled by U.S. Steel. His crews, blacklisted by the other tug companies, got jobs ashore or left town. Disillusioned and broke, I went back to Lehner Brothers for a job. 1 week before Captain Erickson, newly arrived in port, placed an order for supplies and mentioned to Uncle Ty that the steam yacht Ptolemy was in need of a deckhand. Chapter 2. 10 years in a world war after leaving Tuolumne, I heard from Gatsby again. I was working for Lehner Brothers once more, in Finntown, as usual, lying in bed, still as a stunned pike, on a Thursday noon, as I nursed a hangover from the bathtub gin they sold in the back room of Virtanen's grocery store, wondering hazily and for the 100th time, to the extent I could wonder, through the scrim of headache and nausea, why I hadn't yet used my deck knife to slit my veins and end it all. I was putting off the moment when I must get up and drag myself to the chandlery for the late shift, when I heard the wheeze and shuffle and the creak of warped pine boards that meant Mrs. Ojala was heaving her bulk upstairs, probably to yell at me about the rent, which was late since I'd spent part of it again at Virtanen's. Instead of yelling at me for money, though, she shrieked, "Message for you, Laine, they come from your uncle," and I knew I had finally gotten the sack. But I was wrong. It was a telegram, and it was from Gatsby. To John Lane, care of Lane Brothers, Chandlery, Duluth, it read. Need you here for a great job. Stop. Guarantee $350 a week. Stop. See Mr. Wolfsheim, Mandala Holding, Davis Aluminum Building, New York, before June 8th. Stop. Urgent reply immediately. Stop. Travel funds follow. Stop. Looking forward. See you, old sport. Stop. J. Gatsby. I stared at the buff Western Union paper, head pounding, not believing. Cody's large and luxurious yacht, Gatsby with all his youthful hope and exuberance, seemed so unreal, so impossibly far away from me now I felt as if I had escaped into sunlight for a few years on Tuolumne, on my subchaser too for 15 months in the Navy during the war, only to sink back into a lifetime of melancholy, poverty, and bleak Minnesota weather from which flight I had finally accepted was beyond my power. And $350 a week was impossible too. I was making $42 a week at Lehner Brothers. No one I knew, except for Uncle Ty, made more than 60. It was the old sport that finally convinced me. It kept me from tearing up the telegram as a bad joke. Old sport was an expression Cody had used and that Gatsby picked up from the old man along with his mid-Atlantic accent. I think Jay had tried it out on me to work his tongue around it himself. Paradoxically, a second factor that helped convince me was the vast improbability of a $350 wage for someone as unskilled as John Lane. Although, unlike Gatsby, I'd learned nothing about the financial world on Tuolumne, I wasn't a total fool, and I knew a wage this high must mean something illegal, something to do, most likely, with a black market trade in liquor that had exploded ever since the Volstead Act made selling it a crime. I stared at that telegram for a good 20 minutes, believing and dismissing it in turn, listening to Mrs. Rogala downstairs scream at some kid she suspected of stealing a potato. It might have been the potato that finally got me out of bed. I dressed and walked to the outhouse and was sick. At the nearby pump, I doused my head repeatedly in cold water. Finally, I walked downtown to the Western Union office and sent back a reply. The single word, yes.